Hi, and thank you for joining us here at Tax Talk UK, where we talk about all things tax and help you to navigate the tax system as is relevant to you. So today I'm going to talk about what happens if you have two employers. How does your tax deductions work to make sure that you pay the right tax? So before I talk about that, if I could please ask you to take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you'll easily be able to refer back to this information if you need to. And we also have other information on a whole host of topics to help you to navigate your tax scenario. So back then to what happens if you have two employers. How is your tax deducted correctly? So to think about this, then let's work backwards. So tax, unlike national insurance, if you remember from our other videos, is cumulative. So whereas national insurance is per period, out per employment, completely separate, tax is income tax is cumulative. And what that means is that across the whole of the tax year, in order to assess the correct amount of tax, all of your income is added together, and then that total is used then to assess your total income. So I start at the end because sometimes it's easier to know what we're trying to achieve, and then the explanation of what's happening when you know what you're trying to achieve hopefully makes a little bit more sense. So as you know, and we've talked about, if you're in other videos, if you're a sole trader and have a PAYE income, and how that all culminates in the tax return, in your self-assessment tax return. But what if both of the sources of employment are PAYE? So you will recall from other videos, if you're PAYE, that means that HMRC used the tax code to your employer to tell them what tax to deduct, to make sure to the best of their ability that your tax is correct through the year. So if you have two employers, then effectively the tax code system is still going to apply. But what we're going to be trying to, or what HMRC are going to be trying to achieve, is that by the end of the tax year, your two separate employers have deducted the right amount of tax, so that when your income from both gets added together and assessed for your total liability, that the tax that's been deducted separately, once that's added together, that equals the correct amount. So so that's essentially how it's done. It's all done through your tax code. And how it actually works, again, going back to the whole year, looking at the whole year. So the first thing you can do is earn up to your personal allowance and not pay any tax on that. Of course, if you go over 100,000, then you start to lose that. But so if you have two separate employers, they can't both use your personal allowance. So they can't both put you on a standard tax code, because then you would be getting double your personal allowance, which clearly at the end of the tax year would result in an underpayment of tax, because both of them have allowed your personal allowance. So the first thing that happens is that it's decided which employer. So normally the main employment, if there is one, if it's 50-50, it doesn't really matter. The reason that your personal allowance would normally be allocated to your main employment is that to make sure that it is all used up. So ideally it would be used by the employer that's paying you over the personal allowance, and then the other employer would basically deduct tax on everything. And that is all fine, unless once you combine the incomes, it's going to push you into high rate tax. So if you imagine, if you have one employer, then they know exactly how much you've earned through the tax year. And so therefore they know whether you go into high rate tax. But if your income is split across two employers, then they won't know what the other one is doing. Of course, because they will be reporting each pay to HMRC will. So if they become aware that a situation is going to arise where combined your income is going to go into high rate tax, then they will take action and make sure that your tax is correct to the best of their ability. So let's imagine that your both of your combined incomes still leave you within the standard rate tax. So now you can see if just one of your employers uses your personal allowance and the other taxes you in full, then overall your tax should be correct throughout the year. Now, of course, another scenario would be that perhaps you don't earn up to your personal allowance in either of the jobs. So perhaps, say, for example, you don't earn up to your personal allowance with the combined job. So then you don't want to have one of the employers applying all of your personal allowance and the others taxing you in full, because the one that's using your personal allowance isn't going to use all of it, which means that effectively you would be overpaying tax. So in this scenario, HMRC would split the personal allowance and tell each of the employers how much to use, so that once it's added together, it would be your total personal allowance. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of things that HMRC can do with the tax code to make sure that throughout the year, if you've got two sources of income or two employers, PAYE, that the codes issued to both of them, or perhaps even more, particularly if you're receiving pensions, you may have several sources, and the personal allowance can be split as you know as appropriate, to keep it as simple as possible, but to make sure to the best of the ability through the tax code system your tax is all collected correctly throughout the tax year. So, of course, there's going to be somewhat of a delay, because if you're reliant on HMRC working out your tax codes, then they won't know until they get the data submitted from your employer. And when I say employer, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about, sort of pensions as well that are paid through the PAYE system. So when I talk about employer, I mean your income provider through the PAYE system. So it is a good idea, if your circumstances change, you can actually phone the HMRC helpline and you can tell the advisor what your scenario is going to be, so that to the best of their ability they can then bring forward the new tax code being issued. Because what sometimes happens is the income gets submitted, the payment to you from your employer gets submitted, what they've paid you through the PAYE, to HMRC. HMRC then pick up cumulative with the rest of your income that a new tax code needs to be issued to either that or a different employer. That tax code gets sent out, normally issued electronically, and then of course you are reliant on the employer acting on it, receiving it and updating it. So it's potentially, it could miss a pay run, especially if you're paid on a weekly basis. So you can see that there can be some delay. So it's not it's not an absolute system. Of course it's better than it used to be before real time, before your employer was submitting per pay run, but you certainly can't rely on it, and you certainly should be checking your tax code, and you should be considering your overall circumstances to consider whether the tax code is going to achieve the aim that when you get to the end of the tax year, that all of your income, if you calculate then the liability, that the tax code will have collected the right tax. And what will happen is, if it hasn't, then you will receive a tax calculation from HMRC, and you will either receive a refund of any overpaid tax, or you will be required to pay any underpaid tax. So this is why I stress it's important through the year to have, some sort of understanding of what your tax code's achieving, what your total income, and particularly if you're going to not be using all of your allowance through one employer, or if your total income is going to push you into high rate tax, to make sure that an adjustment is made through that. Because in that scenario, if you imagine if you have two sources of income, and say, for example, if they're 25,000 each, then in total that is 50,000. So we're still under high rate tax, assuming you don't have any other individual circumstances. And so the tax would be more simple and more straightforward. One would have the personal allowance, the other would tax everything in full. So that would mean that when we add it all together, you've been allowed your personal allowance just once, and the rest of the tax has been taxed accordingly. But now let's just imagine for a moment that one of your that your sources of income combined were going to take you over the threshold of high rate tax. So let's imagine that each of your employers were paying you £40,000. So in isolation, that employer wouldn't know that your total income was subject to high rate tax. So they would only be taxing you 20%, and the same would be happening with the other employer. So only 20% would be deducted until HMRC realised that the total income was going to be over high rate tax threshold, and sent a code that meant that more tax was deducted, meaning that it is correct overall. So again, if you know that it's going to happen, a phone call to HMRC at the point of that time means that they can have the tax code issued as soon as possible. And then just make sure when you get your pay slip that your employer has applied the new tax code. You should get a copy of the tax code in the post, so you will be able to check it. You will be able to see the calculation of how it's arisen. You will see what the tax code is, and that should be on your next pay slip. So the final thing to mention when we're talking about tax codes being sort of spread out, and HMRC picking up on situations where the tax won't be correct, is that unless you actually phone HMRC or via your personal tax account on gov.uk, tell them of your circumstances, HMRC are only going to be getting a snapshot of information. So therefore, when they get a notification from an employer that they have paid you through the PAYE system, they will assume that you are going to receive that same income every pay period. So if it's weekly or monthly, they will be assuming that every week or every month you are going to receive the same amount. So then you can also imagine if you have a bonus, for example, or a lump sum payment paid through the PAYE system, where again that can cause confusion. And again, it's important to make sure that HMRC know what the actual system is, and that you just keep, as I mentioned earlier, that you just keep an overall understanding of what your total income is going to be expected for the tax year, and who's using what tax code, and to make sure that you only get one personal allowance. Certainly, if you go into high rate tax, that an adjustment in your tax code is made, And then again, if the combined amount takes you over 100,000, for example, where you start to lose your personal allowance. So just really the important thing to know is that you just need to make sure that that your tax code is adjusted if anything means that you may not pay the right tax through the year. And if you've got two employers, it's really important to make sure that they don't both allow you to have the personal allowance, because that will result in an underpayment of tax, because it will mean that you've effectively had double of your personal allowance. And of course, if you're not sure, then speak to a tax advisor to ask them to check for you, or phone the helpline. HMRC will be able to help you to understand and work with you to make sure that the tax code is correct. So hopefully this is a little bit complex, but that's because we're talking generally. If you just try to think from your personal scenario, firstly, to make sure that if you've got two sources of PAYE income, that your personal allowance isn't being duplicated or overlapped in any way, that you consider your total income for the tax year and what tax bracket that puts you in, and make sure that your tax code is going to achieve that, to avoid having a bill at the end of the tax year. And of course, if your income is fairly complex and repeatedly your tax code isn't collecting the right tax, then it's completely acceptable to submit a self-assessment tax return at the end of the tax year that will just put your mind at rest that all of the income has been added together and a tax calculation has been done, and then assessed against what has been deducted, and that will help you to be assured. So this can happen quite a lot if you have particularly high income, and particularly if you're over the 100,000 mark, where you start to lose your personal allowance. If you have benefits from your employment that all have to be taken into account, this can, just a few of those can very quickly make your tax code quite complex and make it quite difficult for HMRC to accurately issue a tax code that does collect the correct amount of tax through the year. So if you have found this information helpful, please do take a moment to like the video. That helps us to understand what topics people are most interested in, and which questions that you're asking we should be focusing our time. And we will try to break down some of the issues that we've talked about today, because I'm conscious that I talked about a lot, and it's sort of very sort of general to cover all the things that you need to be aware of, but yourself will only perhaps need to sort of consider some of those issues. But ultimately, the actual answer to the question is that if you have two sources of income through the PAYE system, your tax code is used to collect the correct amount of tax. And it's important that HMRC know what will happen in both of those incomes through the year to issue the correct tax code. As I mentioned earlier, please do take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can refer back to this information. And if you want to be notified when we upload new information, then also please do click the notification bell. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.